She said, "I'm too big for you." The ruthless boss pinned her to the wall. "Try me." He grabbed her arm so hard she felt her bones shift. Not a warning, not a threat, a statement. The kind men like Casius Mercer made with their hands before their mouths ever opened. Mave Henderson had been invisible her entire life. Too big, they said. Too quiet. Too much of everything that didn't matter, and not enough of anything that did. She had learned to shrink herself into corners, behind desks, inside spreadsheets, anywhere the world wouldn't notice her. But tonight, crouched beneath a mahogany desk in a 43rd floor office that smelled like leather and blood money, Mave realized something that turned her stomach to ice. The invisible woman had finally been seen, and the man looking at her had never once let a witness walk away. If that were you, if the most dangerous man in the city had his eyes locked on yours and there was nowhere left to run, what would you do? Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because we drop stories every week that will have you talking for days. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if this one hooks you in the first 5 minutes, give it a like so the algorithm knows to keep bringing you these stories. Now, let's get back to Mave, because what happens next changed everything. The fluorescent lights in the accounting department of Apex Holdings had been flickering for 3 weeks. Mave had submitted the maintenance request twice. Nobody fixed them. Nobody ever fixed anything in this building unless it affected someone whose name appeared on the letterhead. And Mave Henderson's name had never appeared on anything except the bottom of audit reports that other people took credit for. She didn't complain about it anymore. She brought a small desk lamp from home, the one her mother had given her when she graduated college, the one with the slightly bent neck that made the light tilt just a little to the left. And she worked by that instead. Every Friday night, long after the rest of the department had gone home to their families, their dinners, their lives, Mave stayed. It wasn't loneliness, exactly. Or maybe it was, and she had simply stopped recognizing the feeling because it had been there so long it felt like furniture. She was good at the work. Better than good. She was exceptional, and she knew it. And that knowledge lived in a very small, very quiet place inside her that she rarely visited because acknowledging it out loud had never done her any favors. The one time she had corrected a senior partner's financial projection in a department meeting, he had laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Let's hear from someone with a bit more experience next time, shall we?" The whole room had looked at her the way people look at something that doesn't belong, and Mave had gathered her papers and looked at her lap and said nothing. That was 8 months ago. She had not spoken in a department meeting since. Tonight was a Friday in November. The building was empty except for the security guard on the ground floor who had been asleep since 11, and Mave, and the numbers on her screen that were telling her something was very, very wrong. She had been assigned to conduct a routine quarterly audit of Apex Holdings subsidiary accounts. Standard work. Tedious work. The kind of work that required 4 cups of coffee and a willingness to cross-reference line items until your eyes went fuzzy. Mave had been doing it for 2 hours when she noticed the first anomaly, a transfer of $800,000 from a subsidiary account in Delaware to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. The shell company's name was Triton Consulting LLC. Triton Consulting LLC had no website, no registered employees, no address beyond a P.O. box. And in the last 14 months, exactly $11,400,000 had been funneled through it in increments just small enough to avoid automatic federal reporting triggers. Mave sat very still for a moment. Then she pulled up the next subsidiary account, and the next. By midnight, she had traced $23 million moving through a network of shell companies so intricately constructed that it would have taken most forensic accountants weeks to unravel. Mave had done it in 2 hours because she saw numbers the way some people saw music, not as separate pieces but as a whole, a composition, and when something was off-key, she heard it immediately. Her hands were shaking when she pulled up the names attached to the parent accounts. Marcus Dellaway, CFO of Apex Holdings, 11-year employee, golf handicap of 12, according to the charity auction program pinned to the company bulletin board. The transfers had his authorization codes on every single one. Mave pressed her palms flat on the desk and breathed. She should call someone. She knew that. The SEC, the FBI, a lawyer. She did not personally know any lawyers, which struck her, in this moment, as a significant oversight in her life planning. She reached for her phone and realized she had left it charging at her desk, 20 feet away, and that was when she heard the elevator. Not the elevator running. The building's elevators ran constantly. People worked late. That was normal. What was not normal was the sound of it at 12:17 in the morning, and the sound of multiple sets of footsteps moving with the kind of coordinated quiet that suggested these men had done this before. Mave did not think. She moved. She grabbed the USB drive from her desk drawer. She kept one there, out of habit, a forensic accounting habit her professor had drilled into her years ago. Always have your evidence somewhere physical. Never trust only the cloud. And she plugged it into her computer and started copying files. 43 seconds. The copy bar moved with the enthusiasm of a Monday morning commute. She watched the door. The footsteps stopped outside the accounting department. 31 seconds. She heard a key card. The beep of the electronic lock. 20 seconds. Mave yanked the drive, killed her monitor, and dropped beneath her desk in one motion that surprised even her, because she was not a woman who moved fast. Or rather, she had never believed she was, because that was another thing people had communicated to her, in small cutting ways, over many years. Her body was not built for quick. Her body was built for sitting, for being still, for taking up space in the way that inconvenienced others. She was entirely still beneath that desk, knees pulled to her chest, lamp cord pressed against her thigh, USB drive clenched in her fist, when Marcus Dellaway walked into the accounting department arguing with someone she couldn't see. "I told you it would be ready by Wednesday," Dellaway was saying. His voice was higher than it sounded in meetings, strained, the voice of a man who had not slept. "The wire was delayed because the compliance system flagged it. Not because I was holding anything back, you have to understand that." "Understanding," said another voice, "is not something I'm here to offer you tonight." The second voice stopped Mave's blood cold. Not because it was loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of voice that had learned long ago it didn't need volume to be heard. Low. Measured. The kind of calm that lived on the other side of having done terrible things so many times they no longer required emotional preparation. She heard Dellaway's footsteps, uneven, stumbling slightly, the walk of a frightened man trying to appear otherwise. "Mr. Mercer, I promise you, the funds will be transferred in full by when, Marcus?" A pause. "By end of next week. I just need—" "You needed 2 weeks last month. Then you needed until the 15th. Then you needed until the end of the quarter." Another pause, and the sound of movement. Slow, deliberate, the kind of movement that forces the other person in the room to track it. "Do you know what I've noticed about men who keep needing more time?" Mave pressed herself further back against the underside of the desk. The metal edge caught her shoulder blade. She didn't make a sound. "They're never buying time," the voice continued. "They're buying the feeling of control, the sensation that they still have options. When in fact, Marcus, you have had exactly one option available to you since the moment you decided to skim from my organization, and that option was to make it right before I found out." "I didn't skim," Dellaway started. The sound that cut him off was short and flat and final. Then there was nothing. Mave heard her own heartbeat, loud, stupidly loud, the way a heartbeat sounds when everything else goes quiet and your body suddenly becomes very aware of how much it wants to continue existing. She heard the man, Mercer, say something quietly to someone she couldn't see. She heard the door open and close, and then more footsteps, and what she assumed was the weight of a man who would no longer need anything shifted somewhere on the other side of the room. And then, because the universe, in Mave Henderson's experience, had a particular and personal sense of cruelty, her desk lamp, which she had left on the floor where she'd dropped it, chose that exact moment for its slightly bent neck to give up entirely. It hit the floor with a sound that was not loud, but in that room, at that moment, it was the loudest thing in the world. The footsteps stopped. "There's someone in here," said a different voice, younger, rough, the voice of someone who handled problems with his hands. She heard movement, multiple pairs of feet, coming toward her. Mave closed her eyes for 1 second. Not to pray, just to breathe, just to take one full breath the way her college therapist had shown her in the 3 sessions she'd been able to afford. And then she opened them and straightened her spine. And because there was absolutely nothing else left to do, she put one hand on the edge of the desk and pushed herself to her feet. 3 men. two of them large in the specific way of men employed for their size. The third, Casius Mercer, was not what she had expected, and Mave hated herself a little for having had expectations at all, because expectation implied that she had thought this scenario through, which she had not. He was taller than the other two, not built for display, built for function, the way structures are built, with weight distributed in exactly the right places. His suit was charcoal gray, and it fit him the way expensive things fit men who don't need expensive things to feel significant. His face was angular and careful, with the kind of stillness that came not from peace but from discipline, the containment of something that would be very bad to let out. He looked at her. And Mave Henderson, who had spent 28 years perfecting the art of disappearing, stood in the fluorescent flickering light of the accounting department where she had worked for 4 years and been known by almost no one, and stared directly back. "Who are you?" he said, not aggressive, genuinely curious, the way a man who rarely finds something surprising sounds when he finds something surprising. Mave's mouth was bone dry. "I work here." One of the large men moved toward her. "She's seen everything. We need to—" "I didn't hear your voice in this conversation," Casius said, and the man stopped moving. He looked at Mave again. At her. Not at the space around her, not slightly past her the way most men looked when they spoke to her. At her. "What is your name?" "Mave Henderson. I'm an accountant. 3rd floor, subsidiary audit division." She heard herself delivering it like a report and thought, distantly, this is shock, probably. "What were you doing under that desk, Mave Henderson?" Her fingers tightened around the USB drive in her fist. She could feel the edges of it biting into her palm. "Working late. I heard people coming in and I—" She stopped. Looked at the space near the far wall that she had been very careful not to look at directly. "I was frightened." Casius Mercer followed her gaze to the space near the wall, then back to her face. "That's reasonable," he said. "You should be frightened." He said it the way you'd say the weather is cold, factually, without wanting it to be otherwise or differently. "What's in your hand?" The pause before Mave answered was exactly 2 seconds long. She calculated in that 2 seconds every available option and found exactly none of them good. She opened her fist. The USB drive sat in the center of her palm. The younger of the large men sucked in a breath. She copied files. "Get it? Don't." Casius's voice hadn't changed volume, but something in it shifted, and the man went completely still. Casius walked toward Mave, and she stood her ground because there was nowhere to go that wasn't worse, and he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the tiredness in his face that his composure was working very hard to cover. He looked at the drive, then at her. "What did you find?" Mave met his eyes. Her heart was hammering. Her knees felt like wet paper. But somewhere beneath all of that, in the small, quiet place where she kept her knowledge of her own competence, something steadied. $23 million, she said. Moved through 11 shell companies in 14 months. Triton, Vantage Pacific, Meridian Slate, 4 Cayman-registered LLCs, and 3 in Luxembourg. Your money, Mr. Mercer, skimmed in increments specifically designed to stay under federal reporting thresholds. She held the drive up between them. "All of it, right here." The room was absolutely silent. Casius Mercer looked at her for a long time. She couldn't read him. His face was not built for reading. But she saw something shift in it, subtle and specific, and she did not know what it meant. 23 million, he said. 23.4, Mave said. I was still working when you arrived. Something happened to his face then. If she had to name it, and she would spend a considerable amount of time in the coming days trying to name it, she would have called it the look of a man who had just encountered something he had not planned for and found that it did not make him angry. It made him interested. He reached out slowly, without aggression, and took the USB drive from her open palm. He turned it over once in his fingers. Then he looked at her again. You're coming with me, Casius Mercer said. It was not a question. It was not a threat. It was simply the next fact in a sequence of facts, delivered by a man who had decided what came next and expected the world to arrange itself accordingly. Mave thought about running. She thought about screaming. She thought about Marcus Dellaway and what his options had been an hour ago and what they were now, and she thought about the USB drive in Mercer's hand and the $23 million she had mapped in her head so thoroughly she could reconstruct the entire web from memory. She thought about the fact that she was a 28-year-old plus-size black woman in an empty building at 12:30 in the morning with three men who had, by her very recent observation, no particular concern about consequences. And then she thought, you have one thing they don't. I know where the rest of it is, Mave said. Casius Mercer stopped walking. There's more? The slight edge in his, not anger, but the specific alertness of a predator's ear catching a sound in tall grass. Dellaway wasn't working alone, Mave said. She had not known this until this exact moment. She had suspected it. The structure of the transfers was too sophisticated for one man, the legal architecture too deliberately layered. But she said it with the same certainty she used when she presented audit findings to senior partners. Because the one thing she had learned in 4 years of being underestimated was that hesitation invited dismissal. He had a partner inside your organization, someone who knew your reporting cycles well enough to time the transfers around your internal reviews. I need 12 more hours and access to the full transaction ledger, and I can tell you exactly who. The silence this time was different. Casius turned around. He looked at her. Really looked. The kind of looking that takes inventory without being unkind. And Mave stood inside that look, and did not fidget, did not pull at her blazer, did not do any of the 10,000 small apologetic gestures her body had learned to make when someone looked at her too directly. You are either, Casius said slowly, the bravest woman I have ever encountered. He paused. Or the most reckless. Mave held his gaze. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Something moved through his expression so quickly she almost missed it. It might have been amusement. In a man like this, she suspected, amusement was a currency spent rarely. No, he said, they are not. He looked at the drive in his hand, then at her. He made a decision. She could see him making it, the brief internal calculation of a man who trusted his own judgment because it had kept him alive, and the result of that calculation landing somewhere she hadn't expected. Get her coat, he said to the man on his left. She'll need it. It's cold outside. Mave retrieved her coat herself. She did not need help with her coat. She pulled it on over her blazer, picked up her bag, and looked once at the desk where she had worked for 4 years. The bent lamp on the floor, the dark monitor, the coffee cup with the library logo she'd gotten at a fundraiser 3 years ago. She thought very briefly about what it meant that she was walking out of this building with Casius Mercer, and that the thing she felt most strongly in this moment was not terror. It was that for the first time in as long as she could remember, something was happening. Something real and enormous and hers. Not in any way she had planned, not in any way she would have chosen, but hers, inside her hands, depending on what she did next. Mave Henderson walked through the door. The car smelled like leather and cigarette smoke and something metallic that Mave decided not to think about too hard. She sat in the back seat between two men whose names she had not been given, which she understood was intentional. The one on her left had a jaw like a shelf and hadn't looked at her once. The one on her right had looked at her exactly once, assessed her, and then looked away with the particular blankness of a man who had been trained to feel nothing about whatever came next. Casius sat in the front passenger seat. He hadn't spoken since they left the building. The city moved past the tinted windows like a film she wasn't part of. Mave kept her hands folded in her lap and her eyes forward and her breathing deliberate and measured, because the alternative was to let her body understand what was actually happening to it, and she could not afford that right now. She ran numbers instead. It was what she did when the world became too large and too loud. She found the numbers inside it and she held on to them. 23.4 million. 11 shell companies. 14 months of transfers. One partner inside the Mercer organization who knew the internal review schedule well enough to architect the entire scheme around it. She didn't actually know for certain there was a partner. She had said it because it was the logical inference from the data, and because she had needed something to say that would make her worth keeping alive for another 12 hours. But the more she turned it over, the more she believed it. The transfers were too clean, the timing too precise. Dellaway was smart, but he was CFO smart, institutional smart, the kind of intelligence that operated within structures other people built. Whoever designed this particular structure understood Mercer's organization from the inside. The car stopped. Mave looked out the window and saw a gate. Iron. High. The kind of gate that communicated without ambiguity that what was on the other side was not meant for people who arrived uninvited. The gate opened. The compound was not what the word compound usually suggested. She had been bracing for something that looked like a fortress, something that announced its own menace. Instead, it was a large property behind a high stone wall, the main house set back on a gravel drive lined with mature trees that had probably been there for 60 years. The house itself was substantial but not showy. It looked like old money that had stopped needing to prove itself. She was walked inside by the man with the shelf jaw. Through a foyer that was warmer than she expected, lit by lamps rather than overhead lights, into a room that had bookshelves on 2 walls and a long table covered in what she immediately recognized as financial documents. Multiple stacks, color-coded tabs. Someone had been working on this before she arrived. "Sit," said Shelf Jaw, and Mave sat, because this was not the moment to establish dominance over her seating arrangements. She was alone in the room for 4 minutes, she counted, before Casius walked in, his jacket removed now, his sleeves rolled to the forearm in the specific way of a man who was about to do actual work and not just oversee it. He carried 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of her without asking whether she wanted it. Mave looked at the coffee, then at him. "I don't know what's in it," she said. Casius pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "Milk. 2 sugars." "I told them to guess." He picked up his own cup. "If I wanted you dead, you'd be at the office still. Drink the coffee." She drank the coffee. It was against all available odds exactly how she took it. "Tell me about the partner," he said. "Tell me what access I have to the transaction ledger," she said. The look he gave her was brief and not unkind, but it had an edge in it, the edge of a man unaccustomed to being answered with a counter-question. He held it for exactly long enough to let her know he noticed, and then he said, "Full access. As of now. What do you need?" "A laptop. The full Apex subsidiary ledger, not just the accounts I was auditing. And time." She paused. "And I need to know that what I find won't disappear along with me when I'm done finding it." Casius leaned back in his chair and looked at her the same way he'd looked at her in the office, like she was a thing that had not arrived according to plan, and he was still deciding what to do with that. "You have a lawyer?" "No." "Smart enough to want one, though." "I know what I'm worth to you right now," Mave said. "And I know what I'm worth to you once you have what you need. I'm trying to make the second number larger than 0. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the ghost of an expression that might have been a smile, in a different life, on a different face. "That is an unusually direct thing to say to me." "I'm unusually direct," Mave said. "It hasn't always served me well, but tonight it seems like the relevant skill." Casius looked at her for another moment, then stood. "You'll have what you need within the hour. You don't leave this room without an escort, you don't contact anyone outside, and you don't touch anything except what I give you access to." He moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. "And Mave Henderson." She looked up. "If you're building a strategy where you make yourself indispensable and then bargain from that position, it's not the worst idea you could have. But you should know that I've had indispensable people before. What kept them safe was not their usefulness. It was that I decided they were worth keeping." He looked at her steadily. "I haven't decided that yet." He left. Mave sat with the coffee and the financial documents and the feeling of being a very small piece on a board she hadn't known she was playing on, and she breathed, and she thought, and she did not let herself think about Marcus Dellaway's shoes, which were the thing she kept almost thinking about, the specific image that kept arriving at the edge of her mind, and that she kept turning away from, because she was not ready for that yet. She needed to be useful first. She could fall apart later. The laptop arrived 20 minutes later, brought by a young man in a dark shirt who set it on the table without making eye contact and left without speaking. The ledger access came 2 minutes after that, full administrative access, every subsidiary account, every transfer record going back 4 years. Mave pulled the laptop toward her, opened the files, and went to work. She had been working for 40 minutes when the door opened and a man walked in who was not Casius. I was close to Casius's age, mid to late 30s, with a lean face and light eyes that moved to Mave, and then around the room with the automatic sweep of someone who assessed spaces professionally. He was dressed down, dark jeans, a half-open collar, but his posture was military precise in a way that his clothing couldn't camouflage. "You must be the accountant," he said. "You must be someone I haven't been introduced to," Mave said, eyes still on the screen. A pause. He pulled out the chair across from her, Cassius's chair, and sat in it, and Mave felt the particular quality of his attention shift, become more deliberate, in a way that made the back of her neck prickle. "Elias Croft," he said. "I'm Cassius's second." Mave looked up from the screen for the first time. She took him in quickly, the way his hands were loose on the table, the way he was sitting slightly too comfortably in a chair that wasn't his, the way his light eyes were doing something behind their surface that was different from what his voice was doing. "Mave Henderson," she said, "I know who you are." His eyes moved from her face briefly in a way that was not accidental, not aggressive enough to be a threat, just enough to be a statement, a small, quiet establishment of terms. "How long have you been at Apex?" 4 years. "And in 4 years you managed to stumble onto $23 million in diverted funds in one late Friday night." He said it pleasantly. That was the thing that made it land wrong. The pleasantness. "Lucky timing." Mave met his eyes. "It wasn't luck. It was a quarterly audit. The pattern was there. I saw it." Elias folded his hands on the table. He had the hands of someone who used them for things that left no visible record. Thing about patterns is they only appear to people who know what to look for, or people who were told where to look. The room shifted, not physically, but Mave felt it. "Are you suggesting," she said, keeping her voice level with a significant and private effort, "that I was in on it?" "I'm suggesting," Elias said, with the smile of a man who had refined pleasantness into a form of menace, "that you're a woman who appeared in exactly the right place at exactly the right time with exactly the right evidence, and that Cassius is operating on the assumption that that's a coincidence." He leaned forward slightly. "I don't operate on assumptions." "What do you operate on?" "Certainty." His eyes moved over her face. "And I'm not certain about you." Mave held his gaze for a count of 3. "Then let me help you get certain," she said. "Because I've been working for 40 minutes, and I've already found a second routing pathway Delaware used that your financial team missed entirely. So while you're sitting here building conspiracy theories about the fat accountant who stumbled into your boss's business, I am actively recovering his money." She looked back at the screen. "You're welcome to watch." The silence after that had a texture to it. Elias Croft did not move for a long moment. When Mave looked up again, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't name. Not the pleasantness anymore, something flatter and more real. He stood, slowly, straightened his collar. "Just so we're clear," he said, "about what you are in this house." "I'm the person finding the money," Mave said. "You're a liability we haven't fully assessed yet," Elias said. "Don't get comfortable." He left. Mave stared at the screen and did not allow her hands to shake until she heard his footsteps reach the end of the hall. Then she set both palms flat on the table and breathed and counted, and when she got to 8, the shaking stopped and she went back to work. She found the second routing pathway at 3 in the morning. A chain of micro-transfers, none above $48,000, routed through a Luxembourg holding company into a dormant investment account at a private Swiss bank. Clean, methodical. The kind of financial architecture that took months to construct and required intimate knowledge of both the source organization's internal audit thresholds and the specific compliance gaps in the Luxembourg financial reporting system. Delaware did not have this knowledge. Mave had reviewed his professional background in the first 10 minutes. His degree was in business administration, his career had been domestic, his entire professional world was contained within American corporate structures. The Luxembourg pathway required a specialist, someone with international financial architecture experience, someone who had operated across multiple jurisdictions. She was still working on that thread when Cassius returned at 3:45. He looked at the coffee cup, empty, and at the 3 pages of handwritten notes beside the laptop, full, and at Mave's face, which she was aware probably showed the specific wear of a person who had been running on controlled fear and professional obsession for several hours. He sat down, not in his own chair, in the one beside her, angling himself toward the screen, close enough that she was aware of him in her peripheral vision as a physical fact, a weight in the room, the kind of presence that didn't announce itself because it didn't need to. "What did you find?" he said. Mave turned the notepad toward him. "Luxembourg pathway. Secondary channel, separate from the Cayman structure entirely. It wasn't connected to Delaware's authorization codes. It was running parallel. Different authorization entirely." She tapped the page. "Look at the timing. Every transfer through this channel happened during your organization's internal review windows. Whoever designed it knew exactly when your financial team would be looking the other way. Casius was very still. The authorization codes for this channel, he said. What ID do they trace back to? Mave had found this 20 minutes ago. She had been sitting with it, turning it over, because what she had found was not what she'd expected, and she had needed to be certain before she said it out loud, because once she said it out loud in this room, there was no taking it back. The codes are masked, she said, deliberately. Whoever set this up layered 3 different authorization protocols on top of each other so that a surface-level review would read the transfers as standard interdepartmental movements, she paused. But the underlying signature isn't Delaway's, and it's not external. Casius looked at her. How many people in my organization have the access level needed to create this kind of authorization mask? Based on what I can see in the ledger structure, Mave held his gaze. 4, maybe 5. But only one of them had the specific access to your internal review schedule and the Luxembourg compliance system knowledge to construct this particular pathway. The room was very quiet. Casius said, "Who?" Before Mave could answer, the door opened. Elias Croft stood in the doorway. He looked at Casius first, then at Mave, then at the notepad on the table between them, and something crossed his face, brief, controlled, gone in under a second, that Mave filed away in a place she'd come back to. "You're still at it," Elias said, directing it at Casius in the tone of a man reporting in, not intruding. "Rains is asking about the convoy schedule for tomorrow." "Tell him to wait," Casius said, without looking up from the notepad. Elias's eyes went to Mave, settled there. "How's the progress?" "Significant," Casius said. "She find anything useful?" "Several things." Casius looked up then, not at Elias, but at the mid-distance, in the way of a man whose mind was assembling something. "I'll debrief you in the morning. Get some sleep." A beat. Elias's gaze stayed on Mave a half-second longer than it needed to. "Sure," he said. "Good night." The door closed. Mave did not look at Casius immediately. When she did, he was already looking at her. "You stopped talking," he said, when he walked in. "I noticed that too," Mave said. "You were about to give me a name." The word yes sat in her throat and did not come out, because in the 30 seconds since the door had opened and closed, Mave Henderson had run a very fast and very private calculation. What she had found pointed somewhere specific. She was, she estimated, 85% certain. In a court of law, 85% was not enough. In a room like this one, with a man like this one, she did not know what 85% was worth, or what it would cost her to be wrong, or what it would cost her to be right. "I need 4 more hours," she said. Casius studied her. "You have something." "I have a direction," Mave said carefully. "I want to be certain before I hand you a name, because once I hand you a name, I need that name to be right." She looked at him directly. "You understand what I mean?" He understood. She could see it in the way his expression settled, the acknowledgement of a man who had, more than once, acted on information that turned out to be imprecise, and knew what that looked like afterward. 4 hours, he said. He stood. "There's a room down the hall. If you need to sleep..." "I don't need to sleep. Everyone needs to sleep. Not at 4 in the morning with $23 million and someone's name sitting inside a ledger I'm 3 steps away from cracking open." She looked at the screen. "I need coffee, and I need people to stop walking into this room." Another one of those almost expressions moved across his face. "The second one I can manage," he said. "I'll send the coffee." He was at the door when Mave said, "Your second, Elias Croft. How long has he been with you?" Casius stopped with his hand on the frame, identical to how he had stopped before, and something about the repetition of that gesture made Mave aware suddenly of how deliberate his stillness was, how much work it took to be that contained, and how much it suggested about what the alternative looked like. 7 years, he said. "And before that?" A pause. "He worked for a private security firm, international contracts, mostly Eastern Europe." He turned to look at her over his shoulder. "Why?" "Luxembourg compliance architecture," Mave said, "is most commonly understood by financial specialists who've operated out of Eastern European private equity structures. There's a specific gap in their cross-border reporting requirements that you'd only know about if you'd used it." The quality of the silence in the room after that sentence was very different from all the silences that had come before it. Casius turned fully from the door. He looked at Mave and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because some information requires a moment of stillness around it, like a stone dropped in water that needs space to send out its rings before anyone speaks over them. "Keep working," Casius said. His voice was quieter now, darker in a way that had nothing to do with volume. "Get me certain." He left, and Mave turned back to the screen, and her fingers moved to the keyboard, and she began to pull on the thread that she believed, with mounting and frightening confidence, was going to unravel something that the man down the hall had trusted with his life for 7 years. She worked through the false dawn. The house around her went through its own sounds: distant footsteps, a door, the low murmur of voices somewhere deeper in the building. Once, she heard raised voices and then nothing, which was more alarming than continued noise. At 6:43 in the morning, Mave found it. Not a name. The ledger was too carefully scrubbed for that. But a timestamp. A transfer authorization that had been processed at 11:17 on a Tuesday night, during a window when the internal review team was occupied with a quarterly close that Mave could cross-reference in the administrative logs. The authorization had been routed through a VPN with a Luxembourg exit node, which was sloppy, the one piece of the architecture that had been built in a hurry, or by someone who had stopped being careful because they believed they were invisible. The VPN exit node had a MAC address registered to a device that had also connected to the Mercer compound's internal network on 4 separate occasions in the past 8 months. Mave sat back from the laptop. Her neck ached. Her eyes felt like they'd been rubbed with sandpaper. Her coffee was cold and had been cold for 2 hours, and she'd been drinking it anyway. Outside the window, the sky was going pale gray in the particular uncertain way of early morning, not yet committed to the day. She had a name. She had been trying to avoid having a name for the last 3 hours. But it was there, embedded in the data, solid and irreversible, the way facts were. Indifferent to whether you wanted them, indifferent to what they cost. She was staring at the screen when the door opened. She turned, expecting Casius, or the man with the coffee. Elias Croft stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, and this time he did not bother with the pleasantness. He looked at the laptop, at her notes, at the specific arrangement of documents on the table that told a story to anyone who knew how to read it. His jaw was tight. His light eyes were doing something entirely different now from the careful blankness of earlier, something that had resolved itself, in the last several hours, into clarity. "You found something," he said. It was not a question. "I've been finding things all night," Mave said. She did not move. She did not close the laptop. She held very still the way she had held very still under the desk 6 hours ago, which felt simultaneously like moments ago and like a different life entirely. Elias took 2 steps into the room. "The specific thing you were about to tell him when I walked in." The air between them changed. "Elias," Mave said, keeping her voice even, "I think you should go get Casius." "I think," he said, and his voice had dropped to something that was almost gentle, the specific gentleness of something terrible trying to arrive without announcement, "that you're a very smart woman who has just made herself into a very significant problem." He took another step, and Maeve's hand, moving with a calm that surprised even her, slid the laptop slightly toward the edge of the table and held it there with 2 fingers on the corner, the entire night's work balanced on the precipice of the floor, and she looked at him and said, "Everything I found is already backed up, time-stamped, routed to a server I set up the moment I got access to this laptop." This was a lie. She had not done this. She did not have the access or the time, but she said it with the same voice she used to present audit findings to partners who were already angry, and Elias Croft did not know her well enough to know the difference. "So whatever you're thinking about doing to the woman with the laptop, think it through." Elias stopped. His jaw worked. The lightness in his eyes was entirely gone now, replaced by something that Mave recognized, from a very old and private place in her chest, as the look of a man deciding whether she was telling the truth. She held the laptop over the edge and held his gaze and did not breathe, and the morning came gray and cold through the window. And somewhere in the house a door opened and footsteps came down the hall, and Mave Henderson, who had spent her entire life being the woman no one looked at twice, sat at the table with the most dangerous thing in the room sitting right behind her eyes. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Maeve did not look away from Elias. She kept her two fingers on the corner of the laptop and her eyes on his face, and she breathed through her nose, slow and controlled, the way she had learned to breathe in the pediatric dentist's waiting room at age 9 when the drill sounds came through the walls and she had nowhere to go. You breathe. You count. You do not let your face tell anyone what your body is doing. Elias heard the footsteps too. She saw it in the way his shoulders shifted, a micro-adjustment, barely visible, the kind of physical recalibration that happens when a person's plan suddenly requires a new variable. His eyes left her face for exactly 1 second to go to the door. That second was all she needed. Maeve pulled the laptop back from the edge and turned it toward the door, screen open, everything visible, timestamp at the top of the file tree reading 6:43 a.m. in clean digital numerals. The door opened. Casius walked in carrying his own coffee this time, no intermediary, jacket back on, but collar loose. And he read the room in under 2 seconds, the way men who have survived by reading rooms do. Maeve at the table with the laptop, Elias standing 4 feet inside the door at an angle that wasn't casual. The specific atmospheric pressure of two people who had been in the middle of something that had just rearranged itself. His eyes went to Elias first, then to Maeve, then back to Elias. Elias, he said, just the name. Nothing attached to it. I came to check on the progress, Elias said. His voice had returned to its managed register, the pleasantness reconstituted with impressive speed. Figured you'd want a morning briefing. I said I'd debrief you in the morning, Casius said. It's not morning yet. It's past 6. It's not morning yet, Casius said again, and this time it was not a statement about the clock. The two men looked at each other. Maeve watched it. The specific grammar of men who had known each other for years and were now reading subtext in the space between ordinary words. She had seen this kind of exchange before, in boardrooms, between partners who had stopped trusting each other but hadn't yet said so out loud. She recognized it the way she recognized off-pattern numbers, not because it was identical to something she'd seen before, but because the underlying structure was the same. Elias unclenched his jaw, once. I'll be in the East Wing, he said. He looked at Maeve briefly. No pleasantness left in it this time, just information being transferred. And then he walked out and closed the door with exactly the right amount of care, which was worse than slamming it. Casius looked at the closed door for 3 seconds. Then he crossed to the table and sat in the chair beside Maeve, not across from her, close enough to see the screen. Tell me, he said. Maeve turned the laptop toward him. She walked him through it in the same voice she used for audit presentations. Structured, sequential, evidence first, interpretation second, conclusion last. The Luxembourg pathway, the VPN exit node, the MAC address, the 4 connections to the compound's internal network. She set the timeline of transfers against the timeline of internal review windows and let him see how they aligned, point by point, with the precision of something designed rather than coincidental. Casius did not interrupt. He looked at the screen. He looked at the notes. His face did what it always did, which was very little, but his breathing changed, just slightly, just enough. The breath of a man absorbing a weight he hadn't been carrying 5 minutes ago. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. 7 years, he said finally, not to her, to the table, or to something further away than the table. I'm sorry, Maeve said, and she meant it in the specific way you mean something when the truth you've found is not the truth you would have chosen to find. Don't be. His voice was flat. Not angry, past angry, in the territory that comes after anger burns through its fuel. How certain are you? The MAC address is a match. The timestamps align. The Luxembourg compliance gap is a specialty knowledge marker that narrows the field significantly. She paused. I'm certain enough that I would put my name on this in front of a federal review board. Casius stood. He stood the way structures collapse. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift of load-bearing elements, something that had been holding weight finding it can't anymore. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the gray morning, and Maeve sat at the table with the evidence and the cold coffee and the particular discomfort of being the person who has just handed someone an irreversible truth. He was with me when I started this, Casius said, still facing the window. Before any of this was what it is now. He's the reason we survived the Corrigan consolidation in 2019. He put himself between me and a bullet in Brussels, and I took the man out of the hospital myself when it was done. A pause. 7 years. Mave said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be hollow. Who is he working with? Casius asked. The transfers were outbound to an account I can trace one more level if you give me another 2 hours. The holding structure on the receiving end, she pulled up the next tab, is registered to a financial management group called Vega Capital. It's a ghost structure, but Vega Capital has a documented relationship with a private security contracting firm that operates out of Minsk, and that firm, she zoomed in on a corporate registration document she'd found 40 minutes ago, is directly linked to a man named Anton Ivanov. Casius turned from the window. The name landed in the room the way certain words land, not loudly, but with mass, the way something heavy lands on a floor, felt through the soles of your feet before you fully register the sound. Say that again, he said. Anton Ivanov, Mave said. The Vega Capital structure is his, or it's run by people who answer to him. The financial signature matches his operations documentation pattern. I cross-referenced it against 3 public filings from his registered European businesses. Same legal architecture, same layering method, same jurisdictional strategy. She looked at him. Elias hasn't just been skimming your accounts, Casius. He's been moving your operational capital directly into the hands of your primary rival for at least 14 months. Casius walked to the table. He picked up her notepad. He read it the way a man reads something he already half knows but hoped he was wrong about, each line of her handwriting another door closing behind him. He set the notepad down. Get your things, he said. I don't have whatever you need from this room. You're moving. He was already at the door. Phone out. Now, Mave. Right now. She grabbed the laptop, her notes, her bag, and followed him into the hallway. And the difference between the Casius who had walked into that room 20 minutes ago and the one moving ahead of her down the corridor now was not visible in any single feature. His face was still contained, his pace was measured, but it was there in the density of him, in the way the men they passed in the hallway saw it and straightened without being told. He put her in a different room, smaller, no windows that faced the exterior, a heavy door, 2 men outside it. I'll be back within the hour, he said. What are you going to do? Mave asked. He looked at her from the doorway. The tiredness was fully visible now, not hidden anymore, sitting in the hollows beneath his eyes and in the set of his mouth. What I should have done before I let this get to $23 million, he said, and closed the door. Mave sat on the edge of the narrow cot against the wall and put the laptop beside her and held her notes in her lap and listened to the house. For 20 minutes it was quiet. Then it wasn't. She couldn't hear words, but she could hear the shape of what was happening. Voices raised and then cut off, footsteps rapid and then stopping, a sound that she chose to interpret as a door being pushed open hard. Then more voices, lower, the kind of low that meant controlled rather than calm. Then a single sound, short and flat, identical to the one she had heard in the accounting department on the 43rd floor, and then nothing. Mave pressed her palms to her knees and stared at the opposite wall and breathed and counted and got to 20 before the door opened, and a man she hadn't seen before told her it was time to move. She did not ask questions. She picked up the laptop and the notepad and followed. They put her in an armored SUV, 3 vehicles total. Casius was in the lead car. She was in the middle vehicle with 2 men she had not been introduced to and would not be introduced to, and the convoy moved out through the Iron Gate and into the morning city, which had committed itself to gray and light rain. They drove for 35 minutes. Mave tracked the route from memory. She had always had the specific spatial recall of a person who had spent a lot of time in transit alone. No one to talk to, nothing to do but notice things. She built the map as they moved, east on the main arterial, north at the river crossing, into an industrial corridor that had the specific visual signature of a neighborhood in the process of being converted from manufacturing to something else but not finished yet, the old and the new sitting beside each other in uncomfortable adjacency. They stopped at a building that looked from the outside like a mid-scale import logistics warehouse. Inside it was something else. The ground floor was functional, legitimate, forklifts and pallets, and the smell of packing material, but past a door in the back wall, it changed. Open plan. Screens. 3 people at workstations who looked up when Casius came through and went back to their screens without being told to. It was a secondary operations center. Mave understood this without being told. The same way she understood financial structures without needing them explained. The architecture communicated its own purpose. Casius crossed to a conference table at the far end and spread a map. He looked at Mave. I need you on the accounts again. There's a laptop ready. I need to know where Ivanov's money is actually held. The real accounts, not the shell layer. If we're going into this, I want to hit his financial structure simultaneously. Going into what? Mave said. He'll know Elias is gone, Casius said. He won't wait. He has eyes inside this organization, had them, through Elias. And the moment those go dark, he'll move. He looked at the map. We have a window, probably 12 hours. You're going to engage him. I'm going to end this. Mave looked at the map. At the city grid spread across the table, routes marked, locations circled. At the hard-set lines of Casius's face above it. She thought about the $23 million, about 14 months of transfers, about Elias Croft standing in the lamplight of the accounting room with his light eyes doing their quiet calculating, and the way he'd looked at her over Casius's shoulder when he walked in at midnight, not with surprise but with the specific attentiveness of a man checking on a variable. He knew I was there last night, Mave said. Casius looked up from the map. At the office, she said. When I was under the desk. He knew someone was there before the lamp fell. She was thinking out loud now, following the thread back. He came in 2 steps ahead of you, and he looked at the room differently than the other men did. He was looking for something. Not for Dellaway. He already knew about Dellaway. I was looking to see if there was a witness. She paused. He was there to make sure it was clean. Casius was very still. When you kept me alive, Mave said, that wasn't in his plan. That's why he came to the accounting room this morning. Not to check on progress, to assess whether I'd found him yet. She looked at the map. He's been managing this from inside for 14 months. He's careful, which means he has a contingency for this scenario. What scenario? The scenario where the inside man is burned. She met his eyes. He'll have a trigger, something already in motion that activates if he goes dark. He won't have left himself with nothing. Casius picked up his phone. The call lasted 90 seconds. Whatever the answer was on the other end of it changed the texture of his face again. A deepening, a compression, something folding inward. He lowered the phone. Ivanov's convoy left Minsk 18 hours ago, he said. We just confirmed it. They're already here. The room shifted. The 3 people at workstations looked up at the same moment, the involuntary response of people who have heard the one thing they were hoping not to hear. Mave looked at the map. 18 hours from Minsk. Highway routes, border logistics, the specific transit time for a convoy large enough to matter. She did the arithmetic automatically, helplessly, the numbers assembling themselves in her head without being asked. They weren't coming in response to Elias going dark, she said slowly. They were already in motion before that. Yes. Which means Elias wasn't the trigger. She stared at the map. The money was. Casius looked at her. The $23 million, Mave said. He wasn't just diverting funds. He was pre-positioning capital, building a war chest for Ivanov on your own money, time to be ready by the time the convoy arrived. She pressed her finger to a point on the map without thinking. The transfers didn't complete. I interrupted them last night, which means Ivanov is arriving with a plan that's funded on capital he doesn't actually have yet. She looked up. He doesn't know that. He thinks the money is already where Elias told him it would be. The silence in the room was the silence of a calculation completing. Casius looked at her finger on the map, at the point she'd pressed without realizing. The river crossing, the northern arterial, the most logical entry corridor for a convoy coming in from the eastern border. How confident are you, he said. In the financial analysis? Completely. She straightened. In the convoy routing, I'm extrapolating from infrastructure data and basic logistics. But if you have people who know this city's entry points, we do. Then the money is your lever, Mave said. Ivanov doesn't know it's not there. If you can isolate his financial access before his convoy reaches the city, he's walking into a fight he can't sustain past the first 48 hours. His soldiers need to be paid. That's not a philosophy. That's a cash flow problem. And cash flow problems are what I do. Casius looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the rain had thickened, running down the high warehouse windows in gray sheets. Somewhere in the building, something mechanical started and then stopped. You're describing a plan, he said. I'm describing the financial architecture of a plan, Mave said. What you do with the other parts is your department. He looked at the map again, then at the three people at the workstations, who were watching him with the careful attention of people who have committed themselves to a chain of command and are waiting for the next link. Get me the vehicle schedules, he said to the room, and the room started moving. He looked back at Mave. You said 2 hours for the next level of the account trace. Under 2 hours if I have uninterrupted access. You'll have it. He pulled a chair out at the conference table and set it at an angle that gave her both the laptop position and a line of sight to the main entrance. She understood, without it being said, that this was intentional. And Mave, she sat, pulled the laptop toward her, looked up. What you said about Elias knowing someone was there last night. His voice was even, controlled, factual. You were right. I've been going through the timeline. He positioned himself at the door before anyone called a sweep. He knew. I know, Mave said. Which means he also knew you were the variable. Casius looked at her steadily. He let me bring you here. He let you work. He was watching to see how close you got. A pause. He wasn't afraid of you. Mave absorbed this. He underestimated me. He did? Casius's voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, but not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to respect, which in a man like this was perhaps the same thing. I'm not going to make that mistake. He walked away toward the convoy schedules, and Mave opened the laptop, and outside the rain came harder against the warehouse windows, and somewhere on the eastern roads of the city, Anton Ivanov's convoy was moving toward a financial position it didn't know had already been undermined. Mave's fingers found the keyboard. The account structures opened. She went in. She was 20 minutes deep into the Vega Capital shell layer, pulling the third-tier account records, when the alert came through. Not to her laptop, but to the room. A sound from the workstations that made all three operators sit forward at the same moment, and one of them say, in a voice stripped of everything except information, Convoy sighted, northern corridor. They're early. Casius crossed the room in 4 strides. Mave watched him reach the central screen, watched his hand come down flat on the console edge as he looked at the feed. Traffic camera footage, grainy with rain and distance, but clear enough. 4 vehicles. Moving fast. Traveling in a pattern that was not commercial, not civilian. How early? Casius said. 4 hours. The room processed this. Mave processed this. 4 hours early meant they hadn't waited for Elias to confirm the funds, which meant either they'd always planned to move on this timeline and Elias hadn't known, or Ivanov had his own intelligence stream that had flagged something. He knows, Mave said from the table. Every head in the room turned. Ivanov knows something went wrong. He didn't wait for Elias's confirmation because he already knew Elias couldn't give it. She looked at Casius. He has another source. Someone else inside. The weight of that landed in the room and sat there. Casius looked at the screen, at the convoy, at the rain-blurred distance between it and where they were standing. Mave looked at the account records on her laptop. She had 30 minutes, maybe less, before whatever was going to happen outside happened, and if Ivanov's financial access wasn't locked before his convoy reached the city center, the cash flow advantage she'd identified evaporated, and they were back to a confrontation that would be decided by who had more men and more firepower, and she already knew which side that calculation favored. She looked at Casius. I need 30 minutes, and I need no one talking to me. He looked back at her. The rain. The screen. The convoy moving through the gray city morning like something that had been aimed a long time ago and was only now arriving. You have 20, he said. Mave turned back to the screen and went as fast as she had ever gone, because for the first time in her life, fast was the only thing standing between her and something she could not account. She had 18 minutes left when the second alert hit. Not from the screens. From Casius's phone. A single vibration, and then the way he looked at it. And then the way he said, Rains, East Entrance, now. And the room reconfigured around that sentence like water finding a new channel. Mave did not look up from the laptop. She heard everything. The scrape of chairs, the low rapid exchange between Casius and the man called Rains who appeared from somewhere in the back of the building, the specific frequency of voices compressing urgency into short words. And she filtered all of it into background and kept her eyes on the account structures opening in front of her. Third-tier shell layer. Vega Capital's subsidiary network resolved into 7 holding accounts across 4 jurisdictions. She could see the architecture now, the way she could sometimes see a full spreadsheet in her head before it finished loading. The whole shape of it, the logic, the points where the structure was strong and the points where it was paper. The paper point was a clearing account in Cyprus, everything consolidated there before final distribution. Every wire from every shell eventually passed through that single node, and the node's authorization protocol was a 2-factor system using a security token registered to an email address that Vega Capital had stopped actively monitoring 14 months ago because they'd switched providers and hadn't cleaned up the old credentials. Mave had found this at the 3rd tier level. She was now at the 4th tier, looking at the token registration record, and what she needed was the recovery pathway. 15 minutes. The gunfire started at 13. Not close. Outside, distant enough to be muffled by the warehouse walls, but the specific sound of it cut through everything, and Mave's hands froze for exactly 1 second above the keyboard before she overrode the freeze and kept typing. "Contact on the north perimeter," someone shouted from the workstations. "How many vehicles?" Casius's voice. "Controlled. Right behind her." 3 confirmed. 4th unaccounted. "The 4th is the problem. Find it." Mave found the recovery pathway. It routed through a secondary email registered to a domain that had expired 8 months ago. She pulled up a domain registration lookup, checked availability, and felt something shift in her chest that was not quite adrenaline and not quite triumph. Something colder than both, more specific. The domain was available. For $11.47, she could register it, own the recovery address, and request a credential reset on the Vega Capital Clearing Accounts Authorization Token. She looked at the screen. She looked at the browser tab with the domain registration form sitting open and empty. She had Casius's account access. She had been given administrative permissions to the Mercer financial infrastructure 2 hours ago, which technically meant she had access to payment methods. She was about to use a criminal organization's money to steal a rival criminal organization's money. The part of her that had gone to school, that had studied for licenses, that had sat in ethics seminars and signed professional conduct agreements, that part was doing something very loud in the back of her skull. She acknowledged it the way you acknowledge a smoke alarm when you're already aware the building is on fire. Noted. Relevant. Not currently actionable. She registered the domain. Outside, the gunfire got closer. "We need to move," Rain said, directly behind her now. "We need to get her out." "She's not done," Casius said. "We have contact on 2 sides. She is not done." Flat. Final. The voice of a man who had decided something and was not revisiting it. Mave was already in the recovery portal. The credential reset request was processing. She watched the progress bar the way she'd watched the file copy bar in the Apex office, with the specific anguish of a person for whom time is moving at the wrong speed. The reset completed. She had the token. She was inside the Vega Capital clearing account, $8,300,000. That was what Ivanov had in the active clearing account right now. Not the full $23 million. The transfers had been interrupted before completion, as she'd told Casius hours ago. But $8.3 million was what Ivanov's soldiers were expecting to be paid from. $8.3 million was the working capital for whatever his convoy had been sent here to do. Her fingers hovered over the transfer authorization. The wall to her left exploded inward. Not a full breach. Something impacted it. Structural concussion from something outside, and the wall cracked along a seam and dust fell from the ceiling in a sudden white curtain, and 3 things happened simultaneously. Mave grabbed the laptop against her chest, the lights went out, and someone grabbed her arm and pulled. She knew it was Casius by the grip, not because she'd experienced it before, but because it was the kind of grip that knew exactly how much force was enough. Not rough, not gentle, precisely calibrated. The grip of a man who had had to move people quickly and safely in the dark before. Red emergency lighting kicked in. 12 seconds of total darkness, and then the red, which was worse in some ways. It made everything look like a different kind of emergency, turned ordinary faces strange, filled in shadows with things that might not be there. "The laptop," Mave said, still clutched to her chest. "I'm not done." "Walk," Casius said, still moving, pulling her with him toward the back of the building. "I need 30 more seconds." "We don't have 30 seconds. "Then give me 20, Mave said, and she pulled against his grip. Not hard, not violently, Just enough to establish friction, enough to make stopping a smaller effort than continuing. And Casius stopped. He stopped because she'd expected him not to, and the surprise of it gave her exactly the moment she needed. She opened the laptop. The screen filled the immediate space around them with white light in the red dark, her face and his face, and the account transfer screen suspended between them. Her fingers hit the authorization sequence. She had memorized it in the 3 minutes she'd spent inside the account. Memorized it the way she memorized all numbers, the way other people remembered songs. She initiated the transfer. "What are you doing?" Casius said. Not a question. The sentence of a man watching something happen that he hasn't sanctioned. "Draining his cash flow," Mave said. The progress bar appeared. Ivanov's clearing account, 8.3 million, 30 seconds. Casius looked at the screen, at the transfer in progress. At her face in the laptop light, which she could feel was doing something determined and probably alarming. From somewhere in the building, closed now, she heard voices she didn't recognize, speaking in a language she didn't speak. Casius's hand came down on her shoulder and turned her body 90 degrees, putting himself between her and the direction the voices came from. He did it without looking at her, without comment, the physical reflex of a man repositioning a priority. Mave watched the progress bar. 20 seconds. A door burst open at the far end of the warehouse floor. 2 of Casius's men went toward it, moving fast in the red light, and there was a collision of bodies that she heard more than saw, the specific percussion of people fighting in a confined space. 15 seconds. "Mave." Casius's voice had dropped to something she hadn't heard from him before. Not the controlled quiet of deliberate calm, but the quiet of genuine urgency. The voice underneath the composed voice when the composed voice runs out. 15 seconds, she said. He said something under his breath that she chose not to register and kept himself between her and the room. 10 seconds. One of his men went down hard somewhere to her left. She heard it. She did not look. 5. The transfer completed. She hit the secondary command that split the incoming funds across 3 separate receiving accounts. Casius had given her access to all of them, and then executed a freeze command on the Vega Capital account itself, locking it with the new credentials before anyone on Ivanov's side could reverse what had just happened. She closed the laptop. "Done," she said. Casius grabbed her arm and they moved. Through a door she hadn't seen in the back wall, into a corridor that was narrow and industrial and had the specific smell of a space that was used for transit rather than habitation. He moved fast and she matched him, her bag across her body, the laptop under her arm, her other hand finding the wall in the near dark for balance. Behind them she could hear the warehouse, voices, impact, the flat sounds she had learned in the last 12 hours to file under "Not Your Department." Down the corridor. A turn. Another door, this one with a push bar. Outside. Rain, cold. The specific shock of outdoor air at 7 in the morning after 12 hours inside a room hitting her face like an open hand. A vehicle. Black, running, a man she didn't know at the wheel. Casius put her in the back seat and got in beside her and said "go" before the door fully closed. They went. Mave sat with the laptop on her knees and the rain on the windows and her own breathing loud in her ears. She was aware, now that forward momentum had stopped, of her hands. They were shaking. Not badly. A fine tremor, the kind that happens when the body has been holding something very tight for a very long time and suddenly doesn't need to anymore. She pressed them flat on the laptop case and breathed and looked at the back of the driver's head. "The account," Casius said. "It transferred." "Yes." "All of it." 8.3 million, split to 3 of your receiving accounts. She paused. He can't access the clearing account. The credentials are locked under a recovery email he doesn't control anymore. How long before his people realize? They'll try to pull funds when they need to make their first payments. Depending on their payment schedule, I'd estimate. She thought about convoy logistics, personnel size, the standard operational payment cadence of a private security operation. 6 to 12 hours. Maybe faster if someone on his team is monitoring the account directly, but I restructured the access logs to run a delay, so any activity will look normal for about 4 hours. Casius was quiet for a moment. The vehicle moved through rain-wet streets, no sirens yet, the city sliding past in its early morning indifference. You restructured the access logs, he said. I have a background in forensic accounting, Mave said. It goes both ways. Another pause. You could have done that before tonight, any night, anyone's accounts. She looked at him. I know. But you didn't. I audit for a living, she said. I find what's wrong. I don't… She stopped, looked at the laptop. I hadn't needed to before tonight. He looked at her for a long moment in the moving vehicle's gray light, the rain tracking sideways across his window. She couldn't read his expression with precision. The light was wrong for it, or maybe she still didn't have enough reference points for his face. But something in it had shifted since the warehouse, since she'd been standing in the dark with the laptop and the progress bar. Where are we going? She asked. Secondary location, safe enough for the next few hours. He looked at his phone. I have people pulling back. We took losses. He said it the way you say true things that are also terrible, so without diminishment, without elaboration. The convoy is pulling back too. Without communication from their financial team confirming access, they'll consolidate and wait. Which gives us the window. Which gives us the window. He looked at her. What else can you do to his financial position in 4 hours? Mave thought about the account structures she'd mapped, the 4 jurisdictions, the 7 holding accounts feeding into the 1 clearing node. She'd locked the node, but the tributaries were still open, still moving money toward a drain that was now sealed. If I can get into the holding accounts above the clearing layer, she said, I can redirect the inflows. The money Ivanov has in transit right now, funds that haven't hit the clearing account yet. I can reroute them before his people even know the clearing account is locked. By the time they realize what's happened, the structure will be empty in both directions. Casius looked at her steadily. You're talking about dismantling his entire liquid position. Yes, in 4 hours. 3.5, to be safe. The vehicle stopped. They were in front of a building that looked from the outside like a mid-range apartment block, the kind of anonymous residential structure that exists in every city as visual filler, noticed by no one, remembered by no one. Casius got out, came to her side, opened the door. She got out into the rain, and he put his hand briefly on her back. Not a grip, not a direction, just a brief contact, the physical equivalent of a sentence with no specific content, and she walked ahead of him into the building. Inside, on the 3rd floor, in an apartment that had been set up as an emergency workspace with the specific functionality over comfort aesthetic of a place nobody lived in but many people used, Mave sat at a table with a fresh laptop already open and a new connection to the Vega Capital account structure. She looked at the clock. 7:22 in the morning. She had been awake for approximately 26 hours. She had not eaten since a sandwich at 4 in the afternoon the previous day. She had, in the last 12 hours, witnessed a murder, been kidnapped by a crime syndicate, uncovered a double agent, survived an ambush, and drained the liquid capital of a rival criminal organization using an expired domain registration and a 2-factor security gap. She pulled the laptop toward her and went back to work. The holding accounts opened up at 2 tiers. Mave moved through them systematically, the same way she moved through everything, structured, sequential, no wasted motion. She was building a picture of the entire Vega Capital financial network. And the picture was taking shape the way pictures always did when you had enough data. Not all at once, but in resolution, the way a photograph develops, the most important features emerging first. She had been working for 40 minutes when the door opened and a woman walked in. Mid-40s, compact, with close-cut hair, and the specific no-comment expression of someone who had been in rooms like this many times and had learned to arrive with the minimum possible surface area. She was carrying a bag, and she set it on the table near Mave without asking and said, "Eat something." Mave looked in the bag. A wrapped sandwich, a bottle of water, something in a container that might have been soup. She looked up at the woman. "Nadia," the woman said, "I handle logistics." She looked at the screen briefly without showing interest. "He said you were the one who hit the account." "I hit the account," Mave confirmed. Nadia looked at her with an expression that was not quite assessment and not quite approval, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Then she left without further comment. Mave ate half the sandwich while working. The soup was chicken. It was hot, and she drank it without using the spoon and did not think about what that meant about her current relationship with conventional behavior. Casius came in at 9:15. He looked better than he had at the warehouse, or not better exactly, but reorganized, the aftermath of the last 2 hours processed and filed. He had a phone to his ear, and he was listening rather than speaking, and whatever he was hearing was making his jaw tight in a way that added new weight to his stillness. He ended the call and looked at the screen. "What have you got?" 5 of the 7 holding accounts are accessible, Mave said. 2 are behind a more sophisticated authentication wall. I need another tool to crack those, or I work around them. The 5 accessible accounts have combined liquid assets of approximately $14 million. If I redirect these in the next, she checked the time, 90 minutes before Ivanov's team begins making calls about the clearing account lockout, they'll have nothing to pay with and nothing to fight with. Then do it. I need you to understand what I'm describing, Mave said. She turned to look at him directly. This isn't just disrupting his operation. This is a complete financial dismantlement. He will know, quickly, that this was targeted, specific, and executed from inside his account architecture. He will know someone with expert-level access did this. She paused. He will look for that person. Casius met her eyes. I know. That means he'll look for me. I know that too. He sat in the chair beside her, the same side-by-side position they had occupied in the first room 12 hours and a lifetime ago. I told you I hadn't decided yet whether you were worth keeping. Mave waited. I've decided, he said. She looked at him. The rain on the window, the city outside it going about its 7 in the morning business, people catching buses and buying coffee. The ordinary world running on its ordinary rails 5 stories below. That's a very large decision, Mave said. I make large decisions for a living. I'm aware. She looked at the screen. I'm going to hold you to that. You can try, he said, and something in his voice had shifted. Not the contained violence quality of their early hours together, but something that had come in underneath that, quieter and less defended. She turned back to the laptop. Her fingers moved. The first holding account opened its transfer authorization, and she began. She was 22 minutes into the redirections when Nadia opened the door and said, from the threshold, with the specific cadence of information delivery that means something has just changed. We've got a problem. Casius stood. What kind? The convoy didn't pull back. Nadia's face was even. They rerouted. They're not at the northern corridor anymore. A pause. They're 12 minutes from here. The room reconfigured around those words. Mave felt it. The immediate atmospheric change. The way everyone in a room shifts when the timeline compresses past the point of comfort. She looked at the screen. At the transfer in progress, 40% complete. They found us? Casius said. Apparently. Nadia's eyes went to Mave for 1 fraction of a second and then back to Casius. 1 fraction, but Mave caught it. Say it, Mave said. Nadia looked at her. Your domain registration, the one you used to access the recovery portal, it logged an IP address. A pause. Standard registration requires one. She would have needed to use the compound's network. I used the warehouse network, Mave said. The connection was local. The warehouse network shares a registered proxy with 2 other locations, Nadia said. One of them is this building. The silence after that had a specific weight. Mave looked at the screen. 47% complete. She looked at Casius. His face had done the thing it did when information arrived that required rapid internal restructuring, the brief compression, the recalibration, and then the resolution into forward-facing stillness. She didn't know about the shared proxy, he said to Nadia. It was not a question or a defense. It was a statement of fact that closed that particular door. No, Nadia said. She didn't, but they followed it anyway. 12 minutes. Mave looked at the transfer screen. 51%. She looked at Casius. Can we move? She said. Not with the transfer in progress. If we break the connection mid-authorization, the system will flag the incomplete transfer and their accounts recover automatically. She knew this without looking it up, the same way she knew all of it. The financial architecture sitting in her head as clearly as a building she'd walked through. I need 7 more minutes. We don't have 7 minutes, Nadia said. We have 12, Mave said. 7 for the transfer and 5 to get out. That's the margin, Mave said. That's what we have. She looked at Casius. 7 minutes and his financial network is empty. He can't pay his soldiers. He can't fund a second approach. He can't rebuild fast enough to come back in any meaningful time frame. 7 minutes, and it's over. She held his gaze. Or we run now and he regroups and comes at you again in 3 months with the same money we couldn't take today. Casius looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Nadia. Get the vehicles ready. Stagger them. North exit and the underground. We leave in 7 minutes, not 8. Nadia left. Casius came to stand behind Mave's chair, and she felt his presence there. Not as pressure, not as surveillance, but as the specific physical fact of someone placing themselves deliberately at your back. And she understood what it meant because she had never in her life had anyone stand there before. She typed. The transfer processed, 63%. Somewhere below, she heard this building's front entrance, a sound that wasn't traffic and wasn't resident movement, the particular sound of organized arrival, and her fingers moved faster without being asked to, the way hands move when the body understands the stakes before the mind has fully articulated them. 78%. Casius's hand came down on the back of her chair, not touching her, just there. Mave, he said quietly. I know, she said. 89. Below, something hit the stairwell door with the force of people who were not waiting to be let in. 94. Casius said her name again, just the one word, low and even, and she felt his hand move from the chair to her shoulder, not gripping, just contact, the physical form of I am here, and she looked at the screen and the number climbed and the stairwell sounds got louder and she held everything in her body absolutely still, except her hands. 97. The apartment door came off its hinges, and the screen said 100%, and Mave hit the finalize command and closed the laptop in one motion, and Casius pulled her out of the chair and toward the back of the apartment with the specific velocity of a man who has been waiting for this exact moment to move. And behind them the room filled with voices and the flat sound of impact, and Mave ran for the first time in years without thinking about what she looked like running, without the familiar self-conscious awareness of her body moving through space, because there was no room left in her for anything except forward and fast, and the laptop clutched against her chest, and the back exit door 20 feet ahead, and Casius's hand at her back. And the transfer was done, and they were not stopped yet, and the stairs came up under her feet as she hit them at speed and went down, and the city waited somewhere below in the rain, and she did not look back. The stairs were wet. Someone had propped the back exit open. Nadia, probably, or whoever Nadia had sent ahead. And the rain had come in and pooled on the concrete landing, and Mave hit the third step from the bottom at speed, and her foot went sideways and she went down hard on her left knee, laptop still clutched to her chest, one hand catching the rail and the other catching nothing. The pain was immediate and specific, and she registered it the way you register pain when stopping is not an option. Filed it, noted its location, moved. Casius was beside her before she finished falling, not catching her, she was already down, but his hand was under her arm as she pushed back up, and she was up, and they were through the door and into the back alley before she had time to process that she was limping. The alley ran between two buildings and came out on a side street. A black vehicle was running at the curb, Nadia in the passenger seat, a man Mave didn't know driving. They got in, Mave first, Casius behind her, and the car moved before the door closed. Mave looked down at her knee. Her slacks were torn. Through the tear, she could see that the skin was split and bleeding in the specific way of concrete impact, not deep but wide, the kind of wound that would stiffen badly in an hour. She pressed her palm over it and held pressure and looked out the window. Left knee, Casius said from beside her. It's fine. It's bleeding through your hand. I know where it's bleeding, she said. I fell on it. I'm aware of its status. A pause. From the front seat, Nadia made a sound that might have been something swallowed. Casius reached into the door pocket and pulled out a folded cloth. A utility rag, not a first aid kit, this was not that kind of car, and held it out. Mave took it without looking at him and pressed it to her knee. The transfer, he said. Completed. 100% before they came through the door. She looked at the laptop case. 14 million redirected across your 3 accounts. The clearing account is locked. The holding structure above it will take Ivanov's team approximately 3 to 4 hours to even diagnose before they can begin trying to recover access. And by then I'll have changed the credentials 3 more times if you want me to. I want you to, he said. Then I need a stable connection in 20 minutes. You'll have both. They drove. The city came and went through the rain-wet windows, Ordinary and indifferent, people at crosswalks with umbrellas. A delivery truck double parked. A woman walking a dog that wanted to stop and smell something and was being pulled gently forward. Mave watched all of it and felt the cloth warm against her knee and breathed. "The second source," she said. "The other person inside your organization feeding information to Ivanov. We identified Elias, but someone flagged our location this morning. Someone who knew about the shared proxy between the warehouse and the apartment building." "Yes," Casius said. "That's a very specific piece of operational infrastructure knowledge." "Yes." "Which narrows it to people who set up or maintain your secondary network locations." She paused. "That's not a large group." "No," Casius said. "It's not." He looked at his phone. "I have 3 names. I'll have the answer within the hour." Mave nodded. She looked at the window. The rain was easing, not stopping, just loosening its grip, the way November rain sometimes did mid-morning, the worst of it spent. They arrived at a location she had not been to before. A private residence, actual residential, a narrow house on a quiet street in a neighborhood that had the specific quality of money that had chosen not to announce itself. Older trees, stone front steps, a door that opened before they reached it. Inside, warm, quiet. The smell of coffee, and underneath it, wood and old stone. A woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and the deliberate movements of someone who conserved effort without being slow met them in the entry. She looked at Mave's leg, at Casius's face, and said nothing except "upstairs, second room," and that was to both of them, and she was already gone toward the back of the house. The second room was a study. Bookshelves, a desk, a window overlooking a garden that had gone spare and skeletal with November. A first aid kit sat open on the desk. Mave registered this and understood that the woman had been told and had prepared, which told her something about how this household operated that she did not have the bandwidth to fully process right now. She sat in the desk chair. She cleaned her knee with the efficiency of someone doing a thing that needed doing rather than a thing that warranted ceremony. It was worse than she'd hoped and better than she'd feared. Split skin, no deep tissue involvement, the kind of injury that would be ugly for 10 days and then forgotten. Casius stood by the window. His phone had been against his ear since they came upstairs, and he spoke in short, flat exchanges that she could hear the shape of but not the content. She focused on the first aid kit. Gauze. Medical tape. A movement of her hands that was at least something she could control. She heard him say quietly, "Are you certain?" And then after a pause, "Pull him." And then the call ended. She looked up. He was still facing the window. "The second source," she said. "Rains," he said. The name sat in the room. Rains, the man from the warehouse who had told Casius they needed to move, who had been in the room when Mave identified the shared proxy problem, who had access to the secondary network locations because he had helped build them. "He's already in custody," Casius said. "My people moved when I gave the order downstairs." He turned from the window. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, the tiredness of a man who has been betrayed twice in 12 hours by people he trusted with his life, and is looking at what that means about his judgment and finding the accounting uncomfortable. 2, he said, mostly to himself. 2, in 7 years. Mave secured the gauze with medical tape and pressed it flat and looked at him. "You couldn't have known." "I should have known." People who are good at deception are specifically good at deceiving people who know them best, she said. "That's not a character flaw on your end. That's what deception is." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not relief, not comfort, but the specific quality of a person who has heard a true thing and is deciding whether to let it land. "You're doing forensic accounting on my mistakes now," he said. "I do that reflexively," Mave said. "Sorry." "Don't apologize for it," he said, and his voice was different when he said it. No edge, no management. Just the sentence, plain. She looked at the window. The garden outside, bare branches holding water. She was aware, sitting in this chair in this quiet room, of the accumulated weight of the last 30-odd hours pressing down through the top of her head. The fluorescent flickering accounting office, the desk she'd hidden under, Marcus Dellaway's shoes that she still hadn't let herself think about directly. The drive. The compound. Elias Croft's light eyes and his deliberate pleasantness. The warehouse and the red emergency lights and the progress bar she'd watched like a lifeline. The stairs in her knee and the wet concrete and the alley and the city coming and going through rain-wet glass. She was 38 hours without real sleep. She was running on cold soup and half a sandwich and the specific fuel of having no other option. She was also, she realized, sitting still for the first time since the lamp had hit the floor in the accounting department, not afraid. Not in the way she'd been afraid at various points in the last day and a half. The physical fear, the stomach-dropping situational fear of being in proximity to violence. But not afraid in the deeper way either. The way she'd been afraid every morning for years. The low-grade ambient fear of being seen and found wanting, of her presence being an inconvenience, of taking up space that she hadn't earned and couldn't justify. That fear was not here. She looked for it in the way you look for a sound that stopped, checking the silence where it used to be. It wasn't there. She didn't know what to do with that yet, so she filed it. Casius's phone rang. He looked at the screen and something in his face changed. A compression, a sharpening, and then a deliberate settling. The face of a man preparing to receive something significant. He answered, listened for 40 seconds, said, "Send me the location," and ended the call. He looked at Mave. Ivanov's convoy stopped moving an hour ago. They've been parked in a holding position on the eastern side of the city. They just got the call from his financial team about the accounts. He paused. They're pulling out. The room was very quiet. Pulling out, Mave said, turning around, heading back to the highway. His voice was even. Without operating capital, he can't sustain a force this size in a foreign city. Food, fuel, housing, payroll, it all stops the moment the accounts are empty. He looked at her. You did it. She heard the words. She sat with them. We did it, she said. You made every decision that kept us alive long enough for me to get to the accounts. I kept us moving, he said. You knew where to go. She looked at the window again. The bare garden. The rain, lighter now, almost finished. Is it over? She asked. Ivanov will regroup, Casius said. He'll rebuild his financial position over months, not weeks. He won't come back at the same target the same way. Men like him don't repeat failed approaches. It's one of the few disciplines they maintain. He paused. It's over for now, which, in my world, is the definition of over. That's a fairly grim definition. It's an accurate one. She thought about that, about the distinction between resolved and finished, between a problem solved and a problem postponed, about the fact that she had spent the last 38 hours inside a world where that distinction was the entire reality, where nothing was ever permanently concluded, only temporarily held. What happens now? She said. To me. Casius came to the desk and sat on its edge, not in a chair, not at a formal distance, closer than any of their earlier conversations. Close enough that she was aware of the specific quality of his presence in the way she'd been aware of it in the warehouse, at the conference table, in the back of the vehicle, as weight, as warmth, as something that occupied space deliberately. That depends, he said, on what you want. She looked up at him. That's a sentence I wasn't expecting from you. I'm aware. He looked at his hands for a moment, a rare gesture, one she hadn't seen from him before, this brief acknowledgement of his own hands as things that had done things. You came into this without a choice. I want to be clear that I understand that. You killed the man who was going to kill me and then had me kidnapped, Mave said. I'm aware of the entry conditions. Yes. No flinching from it. She appreciated that. And in the last 38 hours, you uncovered my financial breach, identified my inside man, survived a physical ambush, and dismantled the operating capital of a rival organization using an expired domain and a security gap. He looked at her. You did all of that without a weapon, without training, and without any reason to do more than the minimum required to keep yourself breathing. I did more than the minimum because the minimum wasn't enough, Mave said. I know. He paused. I'm asking what comes next because you've earned the right to have that be a real question. You can walk out of this house. I'll give you resources, a new location if you want it, documentation that ensures Apex Holdings never has reason to look at you closely. You had nothing to do with Delaway's operation. Your audit records will support that. You can go back to your life. He paused. A quieter version of it. Mave looked at him for a long moment. And the other option? He met her eyes. You stay. You work with me, not for me. What you did with the Vega Capital Network. There are organizations I've been trying to dismantle financially for 3 years that my entire team hasn't been able to touch. The kind of work you do in 6 hours takes my people 6 months. He paused. I'm not offering you protection in exchange for service. I'm offering you a partnership with actual terms, which I am aware is not how I've historically operated, and which I'm prepared to commit to regardless. She looked at the window, the garden, the last of the rain. You're asking me to stay in this world. I'm asking you to decide whether you want to. She thought about the accounting office, the fourth floor, the bent lamp, the 4 years of invisible work, of correct answers delivered into rooms that had already decided they didn't want them, the partner who had laughed at her in the meeting, the department that had learned her name by the font on her audit submissions rather than by ever speaking to her directly, the Friday night she'd spent alone with the subsidiary ledgers because she was good at the work and the work was all that wanted her. She thought about the last 38 hours, the way it felt to have her intelligence be the thing that mattered, not in spite of everything else, not alongside apologies for her presence, but simply as the most important thing in the room, treated as such, acted upon as such, trusted with actual stakes. She thought about standing over the laptop in the dark with Casius behind her, his hand at the back of her chair. She thought about how a place feels when you belong in it. She had spent 28 years looking for that feeling in the wrong rooms. She recognized it finally, not because it was comfortable. It was not comfortable, this world. It was the least comfortable world she could have imagined being dropped into. But because she was in it fully, all of her, not the edited version, not the version that came in quietly and sat in the back and waited to be asked. All of her, at the table, doing the work, at full capacity, nothing left behind at the door. She looked at Casius. The terms, she said. You said actual terms. What does that mean specifically? Something moved through his expression. She was getting better at reading his face, she realized, the way you get better at a language through immersion. What she was reading right now was something close to relief, though on this face it was so restrained it looked almost like stillness. Operational independence. You determine your own methodology. You report to me directly, only to me. You have access to whatever resources you need, and anything you're not willing to do, you say so, and that's the end of the conversation. He paused. I don't ask you to be something you're not. I'm an accountant, Mave said, a forensic accountant. I find money, and I follow it, and I document where it goes and where it comes from. That's what I do. That's what I need, he said. I won't be party to operations that target civilians, she said. If I see that happening, I say so, and if it continues, I leave. Those are my terms. He nodded once. Agreed. And I want it in writing. She watched his face. I'm aware that may seem naive given the context. I'm asking anyway. The almost smile again, the ghost of it, crossing his face and dissolving. Agreed, he said again. She looked at the desk, at her hands, still faintly trembling at the fingertips, at the laptop case beside her chair with $14 million worth of redirected criminal capital inside its memory. She looked at the gauze on her knee and thought about the bent lamp on the accounting department floor and the 4 years of Friday nights and the way nobody had ever stood at her back before last night, and she thought, this is the strangest possible version of a door opening. But it was open. All right, she said. Casius stood from the edge of the desk. He looked at her for a moment with the full weight of whatever was happening behind his contained face. Not calculating now, not assessing, just present in the specific way of someone who has arrived somewhere they weren't certain they'd get to. There's a room here, he said. Sleep. Actually sleep. The accounts will hold for 6 hours without you, and I need you functional. I want to run the credential rotation first, Mave said. 20 minutes, then I'll sleep. He didn't argue. He put the second laptop on the desk and connected a secured line and left her to it. She ran the credential rotation in 18 minutes, 3 cycles, new authentication on every accessible account in the Vega Capital structure, recovery paths rerouted, activity logs set to flag any access attempts with a 12-hour delay alert. When she was done, she sat for a moment and looked at what was on the screen. The empty architecture of a financial network that had, 12 hours ago, been preparing to fund a war. Now it was a shell. Hollow. A structure with all the content removed, like a building with the walls still standing and nothing inside. She closed the laptop. The room they gave her was on the same floor as the study. Small, clean, a window that faced the side street and let in the gray mid-morning light. A bed with actual sheets. Mave sat on the edge of it and took off her shoes and looked at the gauze on her knee and thought about nothing specific, just let her mind rest in its own quiet for a moment, which it hadn't done in 38 hours. She thought about her mother's lamp, the bent neck, the way the light had always tilted just slightly to the left, and how she'd worked inside that imperfect light for 4 years without thinking much about it. She lay down. She was asleep inside of 4 minutes. She woke to late afternoon light, amber, low-angled, the specific quality of winter light that arrives briefly and at a slant, committing to nothing. The clock on the wall said 3:30. She had slept for 5.5 hours, which was more than she'd expected and less than she needed, which was probably the right description of most things. She lay still for a moment and ran a quiet inventory. Knee, stiff, sore, functional. Back, aching from the concrete landing and the hours of hunching over laptops. Head, clear, which surprised her. Not the foggy half-clarity of disrupted sleep, but actual clarity, the kind that comes when the mind has processed something enormous, while the body was unconscious and presents the results calmly upon waking. The results were, everything had changed, and she was the same person she'd been when it started, and those two facts were not in conflict. She found the bathroom down the hall. She found, on the bed when she returned, a clean set of clothes that approximately her size. Dark trousers, a soft charcoal sweater, socks. She put them on without asking questions about their provenance, because she had reached the stage of events where certain practical mysteries were simply not worth the energy. Downstairs, the kitchen. The silver-haired woman, she still didn't know her name, was at the counter and looked at Mave without greeting and said, "Coffee's fresh," and that was the whole of it. Mave poured coffee and sat at the kitchen table and drank it and looked at the garden through the kitchen window. Bare branches catching the last of the afternoon light. A bird on the fence that investigated the garden and found it insufficient and left. Casius came in 20 minutes later. He looked like he had also slept, though briefly. The particular sharpness of a man running on discipline rather than rest. He poured coffee and sat across from her at the kitchen table, which was a more ordinary thing than any of the settings they had occupied in the last 38 hours. And for a moment neither of them said anything, and it wasn't uncomfortable. Just two people at a kitchen table with coffee in the late afternoon, which was a thing Mave had not shared with another person in longer than she could easily calculate. Ivanov's convoy crossed the eastern border at noon, Casius said. His financial team filed an emergency recovery request with their Luxembourg bank at 10:47. The bank flagged the request under their standard fraud protocol, which means a minimum 72-hour review before any action. He looked at his coffee. He has nothing to work with for at least 3 days. By the time he's recovered enough capital to consider a second approach, we'll have dismantled 2 more of his active account structures. We, Mave said. We, he confirmed. She looked at her coffee. Rains, she said. What happens to him? Casius looked at her, steady, honest in the specific way of a man who understood that she was asking because she needed to know what world she was choosing, not because she expected an answer she'd be comfortable with. He'll be dealt with, he said, not lightly, not without due consideration of what he actually did. A pause. But not by anyone outside this organization. Mave held his gaze. There was no version of that answer that was clean. She knew that. She had known it since the accounting office, since Marcus Dellaway's shoes, since the flat sound she had heard and filed and not examined directly. This world did not operate in the register of clean answers. It operated in the register of the least terrible available option, and you chose, and you lived inside the choice, and you did not pretend it was something other than what it was. I understand, she said. I know you don't approve, he said. I know you're not asking me to, she said. He looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way he'd looked at her in the accounting office when she'd stood up from behind the desk, like something that had arrived outside the expected parameters and required genuine attention. Most people in your position would have found a way to make peace with all of it by now, decided it doesn't matter, or told themselves a story that makes it easier. I don't do that, Mave said. No, he said. You don't. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a small, restless motion, the first physically restless thing she'd ever seen him do. "That's going to be uncomfortable for both of us." "Probably," she said. "You're going to tell me when something is wrong. Every time. And I'm going to have to decide what to do about it." He looked at her. "That's not how I've operated before." "I know. I'm telling you anyway," he said, "because I want you to understand what you're agreeing to. This won't be simple." "Nothing I've been in my entire life has been simple," Mave said. "I'm not looking for simple. I'm looking for real." She held his gaze. "This is real." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the last of the afternoon light tipped sideways and went dim, and the kitchen shifted into the early dark of a November evening. The silver-haired woman moved somewhere deeper in the house. A clock ticked somewhere that Mave hadn't located yet. "We'll establish the parameters of your role formally tomorrow," Casius said. "Written, as you asked. Witnessed." He paused. "Nadia will work with you on the operational security for your new situation, location, documentation, communication protocols. There are things that need to be established before you're visible in any capacity." "I need to go to my apartment," Mave said, "once, for specific things." "What things?" She thought about it. Her licensing documents, her mother's lamp, a photograph she kept in the top drawer of her dresser that was the only photograph she had of herself at 22, standing outside the building where she had graduated, squinting in the sun, not yet knowing how much of the next 6 years would be spent making herself smaller. She wanted that photograph. She wasn't sure why, except that it was the last image of herself from before she'd learned to apologize for existing, and she thought she might need it, going forward, as a reference point. "Personal items," she said. "An hour, maybe less." Casius nodded. "Tomorrow, with an escort." He looked at her steadily. "Not because I don't trust you, because your name will appear in the Apex Holdings investigation when it opens. And it will open, within the week, when the regulators trace Dellaway's activity. You need to be managed out of that cleanly." "I can do that myself," Mave said. "I know exactly how my audit documentation reads. If the right files are time-stamped correctly, my work that night reads as the discovery trigger for an anonymous tip to the SEC, rather than evidence of my presence." She paused. "I already set it up that way." "The night of?" "Before you arrived." Casius looked at her. "You set it up?" "Before I hid under the desk," she said. "I had 43 seconds, and I used them." The quiet that followed had a quality she recognized now. It was the specific quiet that happened when Casius Mercer encountered something he hadn't anticipated and was recalibrating, and found the recalibration unexpectedly satisfying. 43 seconds, he said. "I counted." He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the growing dark of the late November afternoon, and she looked back at him, and they were two people who had been through something together that had no clean category, that didn't resolve into a simple story, that had cost real things and left real marks and produced, despite itself, something that felt, in this quiet kitchen, with the clock ticking and the last light going out in the bare garden, like the specific weight of mattering. He reached across the table, not for her hand, beside it. His hand next to hers on the table, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it without contact. A proximity rather than a claim. An offer. The most careful possible version of an offer. Mave looked at his hand. At the table. At the window and the dark garden beyond it. She turned her hand over, palm up. His hand covered hers, and they sat like that in the kitchen while the evening came in fully and the clock kept its time. And somewhere in the city, Ivanov's empty financial network sat locked and cold. And somewhere in a federal database, an anonymous tip was already processing against a dead man's authorization codes. And somewhere in an apartment on the north side of the city, a bent lamp was sitting on a bedroom table, still tilting its light to the left, waiting for someone to come home. Mave Henderson did not go home that night. She sat at a kitchen table with her hand inside a careful hand and drank her coffee while it was still hot. And outside the window, the city went about its ordinary business, and she breathed and she stayed.